The wind on the rooftop of the apex tower didn't just blow. It bit. It tore at Lucas's coat. With invisible teeth, threatening to throw him 40 stories down into the frozen streets of Chicago. But Lucas didn't step back from the ledge. He leaned closer to the abyss, his fingers numb, gripping the heavy, tarnished brass sextant as if it were the only anchor in a spinning world. Below him, the city was a grid of electric veins, indifferent to the man standing on the precipice. Behind him, the heavy steel door slammed open. "Lucas, don't be a fool." The voice belonged to David. It was the voice of a man who was used to commanding boardrooms, not screaming over a blizzard. David stood in the doorway, his tuxedo stark against the gray swirling snow, his face pale with a terror that had nothing to do with the height. He wasn't looking at Lucas. He was looking at the brass instrument in Lucas's hand. "You drop that, and you destroy a billion-dollar legacy," David shouted, stepping onto the ice-slicked roof. Lucas turned slowly. The wind whipped his hair across his eyes, but his gaze was steady. He lifted the sextant. It wasn't just a navigational tool anymore. It was a judge. "It was never your legacy, David," Lucas said. The wind snatched his words. But David heard them. To understand why a junior draftsman was holding a relic from 1,000 to 920 over the edge of the city's most expensive unfinished skyscraper, we have to go back 48 hours. Before the blizzard, before the betrayal. 2 days earlier, the basement archives of the Vane architecture firm smelled of dry rot and old coffee. It was Lucas's kingdom. While the senior architects upstairs designed glass needles to pierce the clouds, Lucas managed the history. He spent his days digitizing blueprints that were disintegrating into dust. He was scanning a roll of schematics from the original foundation of the old Vane building when his elbow knocked over the cardboard box on his desk. It tumbled, spilling its contents. Among the pens and staplers, the heavy brass sextant clattered to the concrete floor with a heavy, solid thud. It had belonged to his grandfather, a foreman who had worked for David's father. It was a beautiful, useless thing in the digital age, with a cracked lens and a smell of old oil. Lucas picked it up, checking for damage. As he turned the adjustment knob, a piece of folded paper, yellow with age, slipped out from a hidden compartment behind the index mirror. Lucas frowned. He unfolded the paper. It wasn't a love letter. It was a calculation. The handwriting was jagged, hurried. It detailed a geological anomaly beneath the bedrock of the site they were currently building on the apex tower. The note was dated 30 years ago, signed by the lead surveyor. Unstable dolomite pockets, susceptible to harmonic resonance during high wind shear. Lucas felt a cold prickle at the base of his neck. He looked at the digital model on his screen. The pride of David Vane. The apex tower. It was designed to sway with the wind, like all skyscrapers. But if this note was right, the specific frequency of a winter blizzard hitting the north face would create a vibration the foundation couldn't dampen. It wouldn't just sway, it would snap. He needed to be sure. Lucas grabbed the sextant and his coat. He wasn't an engineer, but he knew math. And he knew that the sextant, despite its age, was a precision inclinometer if you knew how to use it. 3 hours later, Lucas stood in the sub-basement of the construction site. The air was thick with the smell of wet concrete and ozone from the welding arcs above. He placed the sextant on the raw floor, using its bubble level to find true horizontal. He waited for a gust of wind outside to hit the structure. The bubble moved. It didn't just jitter. It slid completely to the left and stayed there for 3 seconds before correcting. The foundation was already shifting. The glass walls of David Vane's corner office offered a panoramic view of the storm front rolling in over Lake Michigan. The sky was a bruised purple, heavy with snow. David sat behind his obsidian desk, signing contracts for the grand opening gala scheduled for Friday night. He didn't look up when Lucas burst in, out of breath, clutching the sextant and the yellowed paper. "Mr. Vane, you need to cancel the gala," Lucas said. placing the paper on the pristine black surface. David paused. He capped his fountain pen with a sharp click. He looked at Lucas with the mild annoyance one might reserve for a buzzing fly. Lucas, the archive boy. Did you run out of boxes to label? Read it, David, please. It's from the original survey. The Dolomite pockets. David snatched the paper. He scanned it, his expression unchanging. Then, he laughed. This is 30 years old, Lucas. My father built this company. Do you think he would have ignored this? He might have buried it to save costs, Lucas said, his voice rising. And now you're building 100 stories on top of it. I measured the tilt in the sub-basement. It's outside tolerance. The blizzard coming tonight. The shear winds will be over 60 miles per hour. If you fill this building with 500 people for the gala, the dynamic load... David stood up. He walked around the desk, towering over Lucas. He smoothed the lapels of his $3,000 suit. You measured it? With what? That toy? David pointed to the sextant. It's precise, Lucas insisted. It's garbage, David said. He picked up the yellow note and walked to the shredder in the corner. No. Lucas lunged, but he was too slow. The machine whirred, and the proof turned into confetti. David turned back, his eyes cold. You're fired, Lucas. Get your things. If you mention this to the press, I'll sue you for industrial espionage. I'll bury you so deep you'll need a shovel to find sunlight. Lucas stood there, shaking. He grabbed the sextant from the desk. It felt heavy, a cold lump of metal. He had no proof, no digital logs, just an old tool and a memory of a bubble moving too far to the left. As he walked to the elevator, the first snowflakes began to stick to the glass. The storm was here. The security guards escorted Lucas out the back exit. The cold hit him like a physical blow. The city was rapidly turning white, the sounds of traffic muffled by the falling snow. Lucas stood on the sidewalk, looking up at the apex tower. It looked magnificent, a shard of blue glass piercing the storm. He could walk away. He could go home, turn up the heat, and watch Netflix while the wealthy elite drank champagne in a death trap. It wasn't his problem anymore. He had tried. He looked down at the sextant. The brass was dull in the street lamplight. He remembered his grandfather's stories. A surveyor never guesses. A surveyor knows. He couldn't leave. He needed to get to the roof. The sensors. The building had a digital, structural, health monitoring system. If he could access the manual override panel on the roof, he could trigger the emergency dampers. It would cause a massive, audible clanking sound, ruining the gala, panicking the guests, and forcing an evacuation. But he had no keycard. No access. Lucas looked at the loading dock. Catering trucks were lining up, unloading crates of lobster and champagne for the party. The drivers were huddled by the heaters, smoking, distracted by the cold. Lucas put on his hood. He slipped the sextant into his deep pocket. It weighed him down, a constant reminder of the gravity of the situation. He grabbed a crate of napkins from a pallet and walked with purpose toward the service elevator. "Hey!" one of the drivers shouted. "Urgent request from Mr. Vane." Lucas yelled back, not stopping. The driver grunted and turned back to his cigarette. The elevator ride was agonizingly slow. Lucas checked his watch. 7 p.m. The gala started in 30 minutes. The wind howled down the elevator shaft, rattling the metal cage. When the doors opened on the top floor, the noise of the party preparation was deafening. Waiters were setting tables. Musicians were tuning instruments. The room was a glass box, suspended in the sky. Lucas kept his head down, moving toward the maintenance stairs that led to the roof. "Hold it right there." Lucas froze. He turned to see David standing near the ice sculpture, holding a glass of scotch. "Security," David barked. 2 large men in dark suits materialized from the crowd. They grabbed Lucas by the arms. "I told you to leave." David hissed, stepping close. "David, listen to the wind," Lucas shouted. The glass walls were vibrating. A low, humming sound was emanating from the floor. "Can't you feel that? That's not sway, that's resonance. Get him out. Throw him in the alley," David ordered, turning his back. The guards dragged Lucas toward the freight elevator. Lucas struggled, his boots squeaking on the polished marble. The sextant banged against his hip. "Wait," Lucas yelled. He didn't yell at the guards. He yelled at the room. He realized arguing science with David was useless. David didn't care about truth. He cared about perception. He cared about his father's shadow. "Your father knew," Lucas screamed. David stopped. He turned around slowly. The room went silent. The musicians stopped tuning. "What did you say?" David asked, his voice low and dangerous. "The sextant." Lucas broke free from a surprised guard's grip and pulled the instrument out. "This was your father's gift to my grandfather. Look at the inscription." Lucas held it up. He didn't know if there was an inscription. He was bluffing. He was praying to a god of geometry he didn't believe in. David hesitated. His insecurity was a gaping wound. He had always feared his father loved the workers more than his own son. He walked over, snatching the sextant from Lucas's hand. He peered at the bottom of the brass base. "There's nothing here," David sneered. "Just scratches." Lucas used the moment. He wasn't trying to show David an inscription. He was checking David's hand, the liquid in David's scotch glass. "Look at the liquid, David." David looked down. The scotch in his glass wasn't sitting flat. It was rippling. Concentric circles, pulsing in time with the wind outside. "That's the harmonic tremor," Lucas said, his voice steady. "The building is vibrating at the exact frequency of the wind gusts. In 10 minutes, the shear force will crack the main tension bolts." David stared at the glass. For a second, the mask slipped. He looked like a scared child. "No," David whispered. It's just the HVAC system." He looked up, his eyes hardening again. He couldn't cancel. The investors were here. The mayor was here. If he canceled now, he was a failure. If he ignored it, he might survive. It was a gamble of ego against physics. "Take him away," David said, his voice cracking slightly. The guards grabbed Lucas again, but this time, a loud crack echoed through the room. It sounded like a gunshot. Everyone jumped. It came from the floor. A hairline fracture appeared in the marble, running from the elevator bank toward the window. The building groaned. It was a deep, mournful sound, like a dying wail. David went pale. "The roof!" Lucas shouted. "The manual dampers! We have to decouple the counterweights." David stood frozen. He was paralyzed by the scale of his error. Lucas didn't wait. He drove his elbow into the ribs of the guard on his left, spun, and sprinted for the maintenance stairs. The guards were too stunned by the cracking floor to pursue immediately. Lucas burst onto the roof. Which brings us back to the ledge. The wind was a hurricane now. The snow stung like buckshot. Lucas stood by the damper control box, which was locked behind a heavy steel cage. He didn't have a key. He didn't have a crowbar. He had the sextant. David had followed him up, desperate, not to save the building, but to stop Lucas from triggering the alarm that would end his career. "Give me the tool, Lucas," David screamed over the wind. Lucas looked at the heavy brass triangle in his hand, the sharp angle of the index arm. It was solid brass, harder than the cheap padlock on the cage. Lucas swung the sextant. He didn't aim at David. He aimed at the lock. With a primal scream, Lucas brought the heavy instrument down. Asterisk, clang, asterisk. The brass dented, but the lock held. David lunged at him, grabbing Lucas's coat. They grappled on the icy roof, sliding dangerously close to the edge. David was stronger, fueled by panic. He punched Lucas in the jaw. Lucas slipped, falling back against the cage. "You're ruining everything!" David screamed, raising his fist. Lucas looked up. Behind David, the massive counterweight of the building, 100-ton pendulum, meant to stop the sway, was moving erratically. The hydraulics were jammed. Lucas kicked David in the knee. David buckled. Lucas scrambled up. He grabbed the sextant again. The lens was shattered, the mirror gone. It was broken. Just like the building. He jammed the sharp end of the sextant's arc into the padlock shackle. He used the long arm of the sighting tube as a lever. Archimedes said, "Give me a lever long enough, and I will move the world." Lucas just needed to move a pin. He pulled. The brass groaned. The steel padlock strained. "Seamanance, seamanance." David grabbed his ankle. "Stop!" Lucas roared and put his entire body weight into the lever. Asterisk. Snap. Asterisk. The padlock broke. The sextant snapped in half, destroyed. Lucas kicked the cage door open and slammed the red emergency release button. The sound was apocalyptic. Huge explosive bolts fired, releasing the counterweight from its jammed hydraulic lock. The massive pendulum swung free, slamming into its safety bumpers with a boom that shook the entire city of Chicago. Inside the penthouse, the guests screamed as the floor jumped 6 inches. The chandeliers swung violently. The glass walls didn't break, but the illusion of safety shattered instantly. The alarms blared. The emergency lights bathed the snowy roof in pulsing red. On the roof, the vibration stopped. The resonance was broken. The building settled into a heavy, safe sway. David lay on the ice, panting. He looked up at Lucas. "You destroyed it," David whispered. "The gala, the reputation. It's all over." Lucas stood up, wiping blood from his lip. He looked at the 2 pieces of the broken sextant on the ground. "I saved your life, you arrogant son of a bitch," Lucas said quietly. The aftermath was not a quiet affair. The fire department evacuated the building. The structural engineers found the dolomite fractures the next morning. The echo fracture, they called it. If the dampeners hadn't been released, the torque would have sheared the top 20 floors off the building. David Vane tried to spin it. He went on television, claiming he ordered the emergency release. He tried to play the hero, but he had forgotten one thing: the sextant. Lucas had kept the pieces. And inside the hollow brass handle of the broken instrument, exposed when it snapped, was a second roll of paper. Lucas sat in a diner across the street from the condemned tower, drinking hot coffee. Nina, a journalist from the Tribune, sat opposite him. "You're sure about this?" Nina asked. Lucas slid the paper across the table. It wasn't a survey note this time. It was a letter. From David's father to Lucas's grandfather. Asterisk. To my friend Marcus. If my son ever takes over, watch him. He has the ambition of a king, but the eyes of a mole. He will build too high and look too low. Keep this sextant. If he ever builds on the north lot, break this open. The survey data is inside. Don't let him kill people for a view. Asterisk. David's father hadn't just known. He had prepared a fail-safe. He knew his son better than anyone. Nina read the letter. She smiled. A sharp, dangerous smile. "This destroys his narrative," she said. "It proves premeditated negligence. He ignored the warnings his own father left him." "Run it," Lucas said. 6 months later, the Apex Tower stood empty. A ghost ship in the skyline. The cost to retrofit the foundation was higher than the building's worth. It was a monument to hubris. David Vane was no longer a CEO. The lawsuits from the investors had stripped him of his company, his assets, and his reputation. He was currently working as a consultant for a firm that designed strip malls. It was honest work, but it lacked a view. Lucas didn't become a famous architect. He didn't want the spotlight. But he did open a small restoration shop in the West Loop. He repaired antique instruments, Clocks, compasses, telescopes. On the wall above his workbench, mounted in a simple shadow box, were the two halves of a broken brass sextant. One snowy Tuesday, the bell above the door chimed. Lucas looked up from a watch he was fixing. A young architecture student stood there, holding a rusted surveyor's level. "They told me you're the guy who knows how to see things that are hidden," the student said. Lucas smiled. "Let's see what we can find," Lucas said. Outside, the wind howled, but inside, everything was steady.